Welcome to our fourth forum in the Max Weber Foundation Web Forum series on the digital transformation. Our topic today is nothing less than the future of society. And Japan, Germany, and the US are perceiving this future, are trying to shape it. And we want to learn more about how they do this, how they approach the digital future. Digitalization, of course, is one of the important trends. There are other trends like climate change and demographics, but digitalization is one of the important trends that are shaping our future, and the impact is already visible, can be felt in almost all parts of our personal and social life. It can hardly be underestimated. It is happening whether or not we want it, and we need to adjust, but can we also shape it? Can lawmakers and governments control what is happening? What can they do to enable their economies to successfully master the digital revolution? Germany and Japan are both not necessarily seen in the driver's seats of the digital transformation. It might be for this reason that they strongly felt the need to not just react, but to act and shape the transformation. At least that's what they proclaim to do. Germany with its framework of Industry 4.0, and Japan with an even more ambitious vision of Society 5.0. And then there is, of course, the US, where most of the large platform companies are basically already creating our digital future. And we must not forget China, which is not only large enough to afford its own giant platform companies, it is also technologically advanced enough and politically very much determined to play the game by its own rules. But today we're not going to talk about China, at least it will not be in our focus, but we'll look at Japan, Germany, and the US, and how they approach, embrace, envision, and try to shape the digital transformation. And I'm very happy that we have three excellent speakers here tonight to present for each of these three economies, large economies, how they try to sort of play successfully in the new game, in the new digital game. First, we're going to start with Yuko Harayama. She is now Executive Director at RIKEN, one of Japan's leading, of course, research institutes. And prior to joining RIKEN, she spent 5 years with the Cabinet Office of Japan. She was an executive member of the Council for Science, Technology, and Innovation. And in this function, in this role, she also participated in the conceptualization of Society 5.0. So she's one of course, very well suited to talk about Japan in this, with regard to this topic. Then next we'll have Dietmar HARHOFF, who is director at the Max Planck Institute in Munich for innovation and competition. And before that, he was full professor of management at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, where he headed the Institute for Innovation Research, Technology Management, and Entrepreneurship. For many years, actually from 2007 to 2019, he was chair and member of the Expert Commission for Research and Innovation to the German government, and also member of the Council of Scientific Advisors at the German Federal Ministry of Economics and Energy. So he also knows the German situation, not only as an academic, but also as an advisor to the government. And then last but not least, Ulrike SCHAEDE, who will present the US case later on in comparative perspective. Ulrike is professor of Japanese business at the University of California, San Diego, And she's also the director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technologies, where she organizes these wonderful web seminars on the Japanese economy. Her book, which came out in 2020, The Business Reinvention of Japan, won the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Prize and the Axiom Business Book Award. She's currently working on a new book, The Digital Transformation of Japan's Political Economy. So Ulrike, of course, she knows the US, she knows Japan, she has a German background. I think she's well suited to try to bring these two countries sort of in a comparative perspective. So I'm very much looking forward. We're going to start with Yuko, then Dietmar, then Ulrike. Each will present 15 to 20 minutes. And then we have a little discussion among the speakers, and then we'll open the discussion to the floor. And everybody is invited anytime to post questions and comments in the chat. And later on, when we have the open discussion, you may also raise your hand and speak directly, pose your question directly. Okay, let's get started. And Yuko, you go first, please. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Franz. You see my slides? I hope it's okay.
Yes, yes, perfect. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for inviting me tonight. And so happy to talk about Society 5.0 from the Japanese perspective, but not only from Japanese perspective, but in a comparative way with German and the US. The question, how to use Society 5.0? Because this meeting is supposed to talk about new digital game and what to be future society. And what I try to do is really combine our thinking on Society 5.0 that we discussed in Japanese context. If it's possible to use this concept to imagine our futures. This is the question. I don't have any answers, but I would like to invite you to think about and have discussion together. I will start discussing about society before COVID-19, because it's really able to, we tried to identify what was the trend before. For the moment, I would say we knew a time of accelerated changes, mainly driven by digital transformation, mainly empowered by AI, and also the way we interact and the way we work was really becoming connected and network society. So it was always in transition to this new type of society. At the same time, we had to be keen about what's human can do because of the advancement in scientific innovation. And what we observed, it was that we see the ever increasing sphere of human influences. Take the case of neuroscience, take the case of genome editing technology or other, because what has been said impossible, we see the beginning of a challenge that is becoming possible one day to really not only interacting, but transforming the nature itself. In this context, we may say there are so many unknown because all these changes, not only digital transformation, but the power of scientific innovations, impacting drastically on our society, the way we live. And also, thanks to this connectivity networks, we are becoming more and more independent, interdependent, because of the connections. And it is very useful, helpful for our life, but we need to think about if it is, what could be the effects of these interdependencies? And as I say already, what is unknown will be impact on the nature. Also, in other dimensions, we have been surrounded by many uncertainties before COVID-19, even though, just to name a few, we see the sustainability of the nature was under the trees, and the many debates and action on geopolitics, and even in science, technology, innovation fields, we see the interference of geopolitics dimensions. And as a consequence, we see in some cases, addition to the value of democracy has been under the trees. So it was before, and then since last year, we are living with COVID-19, and the COVID-19 imposing new rule of the game, practically huge constraints on our mobility, including a person-to-person relationship. We have to make distances. And most of the social institutions, including the way of working, the practice every day has been disrupted. And as a consequence, we see increased inequality and social divide. At the same time, as a phenomena, we see acceleration of digital transformation always in place, but it has been accelerated much more. And also to really address the threats of COVID-19, we have been mobilizing much more than before the science, and to make sure that science will be used immediately, the trend of open science has been accelerated. Also, thanks to digital tools, and also by need of COVID-19, we set up a system of surveillance, take the case of contact tracing, and it's becoming really connecting people as well as increasing in the power of surveillances. We see the new practice coming in, of course, virtual substituting partially physical, and the way we are taking decision, putting more priority to essentials. Also, we recognize the key elements of really role of scientific innovation, and we recognize so importance of preparedness for unknown. And what we are doing today, which action taking, is really impacting our future generations. So we have to take responsibility for that. So in this context, what we feel is that we need some kind of new guiding principles. And what I'm proposing to you to think about is to use Society 5.0 as a potential candidate for that. As you may know, it has been introduced by the Japanese government almost 5 years ago. Some of you know already Society 5.0, at least the name. So I tried to really make a quick reminder of what is Society 5.0. Very in short, Society 5.0 means a shift from technology-driven to human-centered, because we are mobilizing fully the power of scientific innovation to design our future. But it should be not only because of the development of technology, you are designing new society, but from the beginning, you need to put human at the center. Of course, we take advantage fully of the potential of AI, big data, IoT, robotics, and quantum technology, so on and so. But to move ahead, really to shape our future society, what we feel necessary to have a common respecting value, such as openness, sustainability and inclusiveness, and to take really everybody on board, not only leaving to technocrats or politicians to decide our future, but we have to have everybody on board to really design our future. This is in short. The goal being to advance, of course, scientific innovation. And in this perspective, we need to, the goal has been to achieve economic growth, but at the same time, achieving well-being by using digital transformation as an enabler. At the same time, addressing societal challenges in the context of, in Japanese context, aging society. And also we see so many advantage of benefits of digital transformation, but we see also coming impact in our attitudes, and we need to have some challenges in terms of how to address these challenges. And also the goal of Society 5.0 is not only for Japan, but to contribute to the global prosperity, including SDGs and designing governance framework for digital transformation. Having said that, after and really with Corona, COVID-19, the question is still Society 5.0 concept still valid today? Just to check what I was saying, with COVID-19, we see, we feel necessity to put human-centered approaches, this much more than ever before. And we see the power of scientific innovation. So we have to structure a society backed by STI, just to name a few, to understand COVID-19 and to develop vaccines, therapeutics and diagnostic, and also to understand the impact of COVID-19 on our society and human being also. And today we need to really deconstruct the sense of community. So we need to share the value of openness, sustainability, and inclusiveness. And we see the sense of community at the heart of all actions. Of course, since we see that increasing inequality and social divide, we need to have this approach of everybody putting on board. So now it is time to act. So as I said, what we are doing today will be impacting huge impact for the future society, future generation. So we need to take socially responsible action. Also sharing this value, including inclusiveness, sustainability, openness, and diversity. And we need to act different in the way to rediscovering the sense of community and solidarity, and also preserving human touch, even we are connected on the internet and so on. So the question is who should do what? Of course, we have the responsibility of the government, but to take really responsibility for the future, what we need is to have a multi-stakeholder approach and also reconciling private and social benefits. So that is for me. Thank you for your attention, and looking forward to have a discussion with my colleagues and all of you. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much, Yuko, for this really comprehensive overview and reminding us what so the framework of Society 5.0 is, and also to address it in the context of the pandemic that we are facing now. That it hasn't lost any of its sort of implications. So thank you very much. Next, I would like to invite Dietmar HARHOFF to present on the German case. Dietmar will talk about German national strategies towards digitalization. And Dietmar, may I ask you to share, if you have slides, to share your
Actually,
screen?
I do not.
Okay, okay, then speak freely. We'll enjoy listening. Thank you.
Great. And my thanks to Yuko already, because this is a great foundation to build on. And of course, I'm looking forward to Ulrike's comments as well. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for holding out late at night and for Ulrike to get up early in the morning. This is a fascinating meeting because in these three countries, or even bigger than that, in various regions of the world, we've had these processes of thinking very systematically about challenges that have come about, especially through the digital transformation. So I'm going to take you back a little bit. So this is a little retro because I want to lead you back to the year 2011, which is the year in which the first German strategy of any sort of noteworthiness, Industrie 4.0, was created. And I have to sort of bring you back because there was no talk about artificial intelligence, or very little talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning then. We were very impacted by the Arab Spring in late 2010, right? Facebook was a positive force because it enabled opposition groups to coordinate. There was nobody talking about the evil empire of Mark Zuckerberg or anything like that, okay? So it was very, very different from today. Now, there was already a lot of talk about big data, but there was nothing about inclusion, ethics, SDGs, and so forth. I think the SDGs were there, of course. They started in 2003, 2004, but they hadn't unfolded sort of any guiding effect at that point. So, but we start systematically, I think, in all regions of the world to think about what does digital mean? What does digital transformation mean? And we also do that in Germany, and we start, or we used to start in around 2009 through 2012 to build sort of platforms where the industrial players, the policymakers, academics, and so forth got together to discuss. And one of the first outcomes of these discussions was what was called Industrie 4.0, Industry 4.0, that led to quite a bit of international acclaim and also recognition, but at the same time was also seen critically in many ways. And I just want to make sure that you understand the evolution of this concept and also where it came from. So it was announced in 2011. It has three names to it: Henning Karaman, Wolf-Dieter Lucas, and Wolfgang Walster. So one person from the German Academy of Engineering, one leading manager or a bureaucrat in the research ministry, and then an academic, Wolfgang Walster. And it was brought out at the Hanover Fair. So the Hanover Fair is typically sort of, or used to be, it's not as prominent now because there have been shifts in the sort of industrial gravity forces, of course. But it was a leading trade fair for industrial goods. And of course, the showcase also for Germany to show, to demonstrate its experience in production machinery, production processes, in industry, in manufacturing. And manufacturing is very, very important in my country. And it is almost a mythical force, right? So we have 24% of value creation is in manufacturing still. This is much more than in many other countries like the US. It's similar to what is happening in Japan. Japan is also a powerhouse in manufacturing. And our policymakers are very proud of it, okay? And we think that the 2008, 2009, the financial crisis, that we were able to withstand that because of this strong focus on manufacturing, because there were stable jobs, because they create high wages and so forth. So it's one of these prescriptions for well-being and wealth and productivity. Now, I said it's a myth because if you sort of peel away several of the layers of this story, it's not fully convincing because we also have wonderful services, okay? Insurance, reinsurance, and so forth. And many of the jobs there pay even higher wages than in manufacturing. but it is a myth that is being maintained. And it's true to some degree. So in 2011, our three protagonists come and present an idea of Industry 4.0, which is sort of a new conception of industry, from the initial idea, the product design, down to the services that customers receive, integrated in a digital value chain that is comprehensive. So this is already quite an intellectual achievement, and I think that needs to be applauded. And then in the subsequent 2 years, you see steps towards bringing that into a sort of politically usable concept of Industry 4.0, establishing working groups where companies come together. We see the first projects being started. Of course, you need some form of standardization. You need lead projects. You need collaboration in order to come up with processes along which industrial players, academics, and so forth can work together. And all that is being done. And Industry 4.0 is still very much an active field. And other policy initiatives like the Artificial Intelligence Initiative, Learning Systems Initiatives, and so forth, and other strategy papers have built on that. Let me, at that point, say something about strategy papers in Germany. So Industry 4.0 was a strategy, so cast in the form of a platform where many other analytical papers built on. And ever since then, we have seen a host of strategies. We have a national AI strategy. We have a data strategy. We have a digital strategy, which is somewhat similar to what Yuko presented for the Japanese case, the Society 5.0, because it also dwells on topics like using data to be inclusive, to be people-centered rather than technology-centered, and so forth. And what is very interesting for me as an academic is, of course, to observe the function that these papers have. And obviously, they have something positive, right? There's information being collected on all aspects of government action in a particular field. So in a sense, government informs itself because sometimes ministries don't know what the other ministries are doing, okay? That as an aside, but we also, of course, inform other stakeholder groups and so forth. It's a way of taking stock of seeing strengths and weaknesses that a country may have when it thinks about developing its competitiveness. It guides the path to new actions and to support programs for, say, a medium-term time horizon of 3 to 5 years or something like that. And of course, ideally, it should also indicate what kind of resources go into that. And indeed, the German government in some of these strategy papers, the AI, the data, and so forth, has said, okay, we will dedicate X billion to this particular purpose. Now, when you read these papers carefully, once again, as an academic whose task is also to look sharply and to maybe criticize a little bit, there are also very lofty announcements of goals and objectives that are not really concrete. There's often branding going on. So the initiative seeks to show off national strengths also in order to do some branding. So it's a search for themes a society can accept and follow, and topics that go well among the stakeholders, okay? So it's a unifying force. The delineation of the goals is not as precise as it could be often, and there is self-praise sometimes for past policies. So you bring in what you did in the past, you praise that, you continue that. So there is sometimes a little bit of a tendency to be path extending, not to be radical, but sort of to build cumulatively on the strengths that you have. And of course, that ultimately leads to fortifying the position of actors that dominate to start with. Now, you may ask yourself, if we have a radical challenge like digital transformation is, right? It shatters the very foundations of some of our nations. It calls into question our sort of historical strengths, like in mechanical engineering, because suddenly digital undermines that. Software is eating the world, whatever you want to take as the metaphor. So in all of this, that might not be as helpful, and we may want to sort of discuss critically a little bit what happened there. Now, coming back to Industry 4.0. So in 2014, when I traveled to Japan and Korea, I had lots of interaction with some of my colleagues there, and they had looked at this very, very in great detail. And I remember one comment that said, you know what? We didn't know that you are so good at branding and marketing. So the focus was not on the substance of the proposal, but the observers saw that this is a branding device, that it is a show, a well-delivered show, okay? Now, that belittles a little bit the substance behind it. There is substance, of course, but I think it gave a first inkling as to what the perception was. And indeed, the sort of the marketing aspects of Industry 4.0 were in the foreground for quite a while. It's interesting to compare it to other international initiatives that were in the same domain. And that is, of course, the Industrial Internet Consortium that was founded in 2014, purely by companies, almost no government sort of interference. And it's interesting to see that German companies were part of that. So they did not all sort of stay in the camp of Industrie 4.0. They also participated in the international standardization and collaboration activities, which is of course natural, because if you're a large corporate, you want to be where your customers are and not just where your nation is, okay? There's a tension here that is quite natural, and I think we should immediately forgive anybody who was in IIC and in Industry 4.0 at the same time. The interesting fact is that when we have these challenges like digital transformation, there's a tendency by national governments, and I think Germany is not an exception, I think it's a primary case as a rule, to go back where we think the sort of inherited or historically created strengths are. And we have a hard time to see that some of these strengths might be called into question. So in 2011, there was, of course, no talk about a cloud strategy. There was no talk about AI and so forth. All of these technological shocks have come later. And to a degree, they have informed Industry 4.0. To some degree, they have also flown into other strategies, strategy papers, platforms, and so forth. But the point of the matter is that I think that we ought to be careful when national strategies that are focused on particular historical strengths reiterate those, that we don't miss the boat on seeing the true nature of digital transformation, which is disruptive, radical, and transformative. Let me stop here and give back to Franz for the moderation.
Yeah, Dietmar, thanks a lot for this also insightful presentation of the background of Industry 4.0 and also some critical remarks, the branding, the marketing aspect. I remember that Japan was really shocked that they suddenly were presented this concept of Industry 4.0, and they thought that, you know, Germany was really ready to deploy it, and then they found out, oh, there's still a lot talking going on. And so okay, so now we move to the third case, but also from a comparative perspective, to Ulrike SCHAEDE. She will talk about the national differences in preparing for the digital disruption, markets versus industrial policy. So Ulrike, I think you have some slides to share.
I do, yes. Thank you, and thank you for having me. It's a great initiative that you have there at the German Institute for Japan Studies in Tokyo. And I also want to thank Dietmar HARHOFF for a great summary in 9 minutes of the entire Industry 4.0 concept, which actually lays a foundation to what I want to talk a little bit about today, which is really about the United States, which is what Dr. Waldenberger asked me to do. So I'll start with the US, but then I also want to, let me see, one moment here, sorry. I want to wrap up then with a comparison between the three countries in the hope that that might trigger a good discussion. So the main points I want to make is that the United States is a weird country, as we know, but it's also brilliant, right? And so I want to dig into that a little bit about why the United States is so fast and yet so not unified in its policymaking. There's a deep-seated suspicion of industrial policy in this country, and that also accounts for super fast, the economic metabolism. So it's all good and bad. It's not that one country is better than the other. This is all trade-offs, right? And so I want to get then at the very end to the trade-offs and private sector versus industrial policy. All right, so I talked to a number of people about this also in preparation of today. I didn't mean to do that, sorry. And the thing that I heard most was, well, the US will always have a policy plan to have a policy, then we'll issue the policy, and then it all falls apart because there is really no deep agreement that industrial policy is even a good thing. There's many allergies to industrial policy in the political circles. And so even though they're often formulated and the plan sounds good, at the end of the day, the government in this country is too fragmented to actually push this through. We see this in the negative way, that the basic infrastructure is falling behind here, that a lot of people don't have access to programs, even though the programs are fantastic. This is also something I can talk about in more detail later if that's of interest. So the US was actually fast, as I just said on the earlier slide. So Dr. HARHOFF mentioned that the first German initiative was in 2011, but the first US initiative that was headed in this direction was actually in 2002 with the E-Government Act. And then there were a couple of other things. I think that's a typo, sorry. That's a 2011 digital government strategy, which was at the same time as the first German initiative. There were government policies for federal agency public websites, and a 2018 initiative called IDEA, the Integrated Digital Experience Act, that was supposed to modernize websites, digitize services and forms, and so forth. Now, to this day, I just had a reason to interact with the US government on some form. The only way I could do so was with a fax machine. So there's a lot of talk, and at the end of the day, we're faxing. So it's not happening yet. The agencies don't have a DocuSign, or they don't have ways to do this by email. At a very basic level, the United States is falling behind in access to the internet. Part of this makes a lot of sense if you think about the technology of this. This is a huge country. And then there's also for societal reasons, there are many unnetworked people, there are many unbanked people, there are many undocumented people. So it's a little bit chaotic, and that's just the reality. But then also the U.S. is a leader in cybersecurity, but also in cyber theft, maybe, and so we see this at the ground level in attempts to equip schools with computers or public spaces with Wi-Fi. This is going to be something that will be very interesting going forward. Also, in rolling out digital manufacturing, where the US has been falling behind for the reasons that Dietmar just mentioned. It's not that big a part of the economy, but it's also that the equipment is old and the 5G rollout is maybe slower than it might be elsewhere. Of course, Chalmers Johnson, the famous political scientist who wrote the book on MITI, said that the only place where the United States has industrial policy is the military-industrial complex. And I think that's true today, right? So in the government is granting a lot of, or sponsoring a lot of R&D, especially through DARPA. I will say a little bit more about that in a moment. And the government is not only giving money to these initiatives, it's also creating demand for next-gen technologies. All branches of the military have their own research centers and their own grant programs. There are huge budgets, and a lot of entrepreneurs in the US are drawn into this sector. So it is sort of it's not industrial policy like a top-down, let's do this, but it's more like, let's create the demand and let's create the private sector initiative, activity around this. So a lot of this, though, is of course driven by defense needs. And what you'll see, this is just it's a title page of a recent Department of Defense report. And you'll see that a lot of this is, the warfighter in the center of this. And then there's the cloud and AI and cyber. And on the left, it says lethality, but also partnerships and reforms. And if you look at how there's this national guidance around this, it's just an example of a chart. So there's a national security strategy that is then driving cyber risk strategies, artificial intelligence strategies, cloud strategies, and so forth and so on. Right? And so we cannot underestimate how much of the U.S. activity is driven from the defense angle. So DARPA is the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It has in 2019, it had a budget of $3.4 billion in grants and science and technology grants. Then so that's a federal level. Then come the states, and this is where it gets interesting. So I don't have time to get into this, but California is a great example. So there's a CCST, which is a council that's put science and technology programs into place. And of course, a lot of this is driven by the universities. If that's of interest, I can say more about that later. I just want to impress that this is very fragmented. But the real action, of course, in the US, it comes from the private sector. So there is a lot of hypermobility, and I'll give you another example of that soon. And a lot of this started in Silicon Valley, which is an example of exactly this. Silicon Valley started when the US government decided that the US needs to go to the moon in the 1960s. And in going to the moon required that we have semiconductors. And then there were a bunch of entrepreneurs from Fairchild and so forth that thought that California was a great place to open a new semiconductor company. And so here we have Silicon Valley. And but that's not only the government. There's also, of course, philanthropy that is driving this. So the Gates Foundation and its digital health initiative, the Eric Schmidt Family Foundation, the Hewlett Foundation, so forth and so on. So there's a lot also of private grant giving that I think is very different from Japan and Germany in how that's driving the research agenda. And then, of course, there are the GAFAs, or we should actually call them GAFAMs now. Dietmar mentioned Facebook. So I looked at, it should be Microsoft included in this because Microsoft's market evaluation topped $2 trillion yesterday. So here are the numbers of current market caps. So Apple at 2.4 trillion, Microsoft at 2 trillion, Amazon, Alphabet, so that's Google, 2 trillion each, and Facebook 1 trillion. If you sum this up, those 5 companies have a market cap that is larger than the GDP of Japan and Germany combined. So why is this important for our conversation here? Is because they're driving the research agenda. So for example, Facebook has a workforce of 100,000 people. A third of them work in the Facebook Reality Labs, which is pushing Zuckerberg's agenda of the metaverse, where he has his vision that we're all going to walk around with these Oculus virtual reality things. Of course, we're not going to have these clunky things, so we're going to have something stuck behind our ear that makes us see virtual reality even as we walk around. But it's not only Facebook, guys. Amazon had the former A9, now the Lab 126, which created Echo and Alexa. Alexa, of course, we train every day when we use her. We give her a command back, and so she uses it. And Google skunkworks called X, and so forth and so on. Here is an example. This is a 4-year-old note, but it summarizes beautifully the hypermobility and the cross-fertilization of ideas and ideation across these three sectors. So this was an announcement that Google Skunkworks had lost its leader to Facebook. But if you read the small print here, this person that was poached, Regina Dugan, was actually previously had led the Pentagon research agency DARPA, and had started at Motorola in 2012, then led DARPA, then moved to Google, then Google sold off the Motorola business to Lenovo, so she switched, and now she is, then she was at the Moonshot Laboratory, Google X, and now she is at Facebook. So this is a sort of mobility and ideation cross-fertilization that makes the US working at all, I would say, in spite of the fact that there is no industrial policy guidance. So let me round this up with a few thoughts on how that's different from what we see in Japan and Germany. So in Japan right now, there is a tremendous activity on shaping the agenda for the DX. And in fact, so the DX is Japanese. This is the Americans don't call what we are doing right now DX. It's a Japanese word. You know, because digital transformation is such a clumsy thing to say in katakana. So always efficient. Japan has labeled this the DX, and the DX has become the thing. You cannot open the newspaper without finding an article on the DX. And in fact, it's been used politically, I think, as a call for urgency for Japan to wake up and not fall behind. So there's some fear mongering in the media, and that enables this policy push that METI has totally embraced. The government has been the butt of the jokes about the fax machine, but and there's some truth to that, right? There's a love of paper, and everything has to be paper and paper trail and the hanko. But there's a constant denigration in the press about Japan's efforts. And if you didn't read any other news, you might think that Japan is so far behind that it's hopeless. When in reality, that's not true. So Toyota is leading the smart city concept, as one of the leaders of the smart city concept with its woven city. And it's setting itself up to be a mobility as a service provider in less than 10 years. Toyota thinks it will no longer be a car company, but a service company. And that's a lot to swallow there. The German car companies are doing something similar, but Toyota is very outspoken about this. And so that it's not as if it's just the government, it's also that the private actors are doing this. Hitachi is positioning to become an advanced solution provider, and so forth and so on. Japan's new Prime Minister Kishida has recently re-empowered METI in a number of ways, including by appointing I'm sorry, that should be a separate item. But so METI is empowered because it's now, again, the right-hand policy advisor to Kishida. But Japan also now has, separately from METI, a minister for digital transformation. I believe Japan is the first country to have such a minister, and also the first country to have a digital the digital agency, which is not only there to abolish the fax machine and to bring, DocuSign to the Japanese government, but it's actually a much, much larger thing that is a call for the government to think about how to restructure itself so that it does not fall behind by being clumsily organized in silos that are industry specific, like manufacturing and transportation and health and so forth, but rather to cut across and develop a new government organization that is actually horizontal in nature of bailiwick and accountability. There's no such thing in the United States. This whole Japanese government program of national policy is would not see the light of day here for 5 minutes. Germany, I want to call Dietmar back maybe and comment on all of this. I think traditionally Germany has actually been a little bit closer to the US in terms of the free market economy, and there is lots of federal and state funding, as Dietmar said, but less. I said no here, but I should have said less military spending. but huge support of the government, of the NPI and Fraunhofer institutes and so forth. So there is a research agenda. And one thing that I've observed from here that I want to throw out here as a point of discussion is we sometimes talk about a race to the bottom, but I think currently what we're seeing is a race to industrial policy, a rise of new techno-nationalism, which incidentally the United States under the Trump administration may have started. You may recall that the Trump administration had this $2 billion budget for American companies to repatriate, come back from China and manufacture in the United States. As soon as that came out, the Japanese government's METI said, that is a brilliant idea. Let's have a $2 billion budget to repatriate certain manufacturing from China to Japan, which didn't happen, but and then came the KUKA incident. KUKA is a German robotics company in Augsburg, typical German manufacturing powerhouse, medium-sized company that was competing with Fanuc and Yaskawa in industrial robotics and was bought by a Chinese company. And that wasn't necessarily a success, and KUKA is no longer maybe what it used to be, but in any event, it called to arms the German government and an German industrial policy initiative. So I think there's something very interesting going on. The DX is a global thing. And as Dietmar said, the companies go where the customers are, and the customers are no longer tied by their national boundaries. So it's going from Silicon Valley to Tokyo to Berlin, but it is also raising fear and increasingly calls for techno-nationalism that I find very interesting. So let me stop on this open note in the hope that that might allow us to start a discussion here.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Oh, thanks a lot, everybody, for these wonderful presentations, very concise. So we have a lot of time for discussion. We'll first discuss among ourselves, sort of responding to each other, and then open to the floor. And I encourage everybody in the audience to already get ready, pose questions, write them either in the chat or later on raise your hand when we open the discussion to the floor. Now, Ulrike already raised a few questions, which I noted. But let me maybe start with a few first round of questions responding to your presentations, because they were inspiring, but of course they also raised further questions, and I would like to pick some of these further questions. And starting with Yuko, you mentioned, of course, Society 5.0 is already a few years old, and I was wondering whether you can say in your judgment, the way you are following Society 5.0, whether you can see any visible impact. I mean, it's a huge, it was of course a science and technology program, as you also said, science-based, but there was a lot of funding, sort of, it was channeling basically a lot of funding as well in areas that were seen as crucial for the digital transformation. And the question to you, my question to you would be, do you see specific areas where the impact is already visible, where this concept, the policy of Society 5.0, the R&D policies have shown some impact? That would be my question to you. And to Dietmar, a little bit similar. It's even Industry 4.0 is even older. Do you see how it shaped? I mean, you showed very nicely, clearly how it shaped the discussion and the image that that Germany sort of could build around this around digital transformation. But do you see that how has it had any influence on actually on developments within German industry over the years, or anything that might have affected the sort of comparative advantage of German industry, or was it just, you know, where people just kept busy talking and discussing? So that would be something. Maybe you have you've been following this. Maybe you have some something to say about that. And for Ulrike, you mentioned in the very beginning that of course the US doesn't have a unified industrial policy except maybe for this military complex, military research or defense research. But how is it possible that all these big platform companies actually came out of the US? Is it Silicon Valley? Is it I mean, what kind of factors could we think of why this is so dominant? Why is it not more easily spread, like in the car industry? Of course, we have big car companies in the US, but then we also have them in Europe and in Japan. So why is this extreme concentration of these dominant platform companies in the US? Maybe you have some more ideas, and then of course I would open to your also lead over to your questions. But Yuko, any response? Of course, you can always say this is a stupid question, and let me say something else. But please.
All the questions are welcome, and thank you for your question. As you mentioned, Society 5.0 is more now 6 years old. It's anymore a baby, but growing up. And thankfully, at the beginning, we are not so sure that this society will survive in longer term, because it was mentioned within the Science Technology Basic Plan covering 5 years, and usually 5 years over and we go next. But today we are starting this year 6 basic plan, and if you look at this 6 basic plan, Society 5 is still at the center. So it does mean it survived politically. So it became a kind of brand for policy making, and you can see anywhere in the policy discourse to achieve or to realize Society 5.0, we should do ABC. So it is the way it is presented. And in more generally, this Society 7 has been captured by the Keidanren Association of Big Company, in short, and they are seriously tackling to really operationalize Society 5.0. So they set up inside committee working on, and they present their version of Society 5.0 and advocating this idea to their members. So as it has been explained by Ulrike and also partly by Dietmar, Japanese context, we have kind of centralized policy making led by METI or ODA, and the private company are following, but it's kind of basic, we follow the basic trend, but we have to really have within company level their own version. But for the moment, still big companies, they are presenting their own version, but still it's at the level of concept or some brand. And it's open to many interpretations. And I'm very pleased to see not only at the government, big company level, but in high schools or other young people at the same time tackling sustainable development goals, but combining these ideas with Society 5.0. So it's becoming more bottom-up action, and that's a new way of foreseeing the future of Society 5.0. I stop here, where I can come back later.
No, great. So it's really a framework, a frame of reference, no, for many people, for policymakers, for companies who develop their strategies, and also for even for school kids who think about what's going to happen next.
But I would just add, there are so many different interpretations of Society 5.0. And if you'll be interviewing key persons in Japanese context, they will say different things.
Okay.
But it's a way to foresee our future.
Yeah.
Taking advantage of DX, as has been said, and not only, but really the way to think about the future in a positive way.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think this positive aspect is an important part of Society 5.0. Dietmar, anything to my maybe stupid question, but
No, they are by no means stupid, because of course you have to ask the question, what is the impact of this, right? So first of all, let's go back a little bit to the intentions. In Germany, as in many other countries, we're now at an R&D intensity relative to GDP of about 3.2%. 2/3 of this, almost 70% right now, of that is done in industry. The rest is done in the public sector, a lot in public research organizations and universities. So the lever that the government has is a limited one, but still it can bring people together on these platforms, and it can do what I learned from a former director of the Stanford Linear Accelerator, who said, look, these scientists and these academics, they are like cats, and you can't herd cats, but you can move the food. Okay, the food being research support. So you can say, okay, we will dedicate some money here in the context of Industry 4.0 or something like that for research programs and so forth. There will be communication with industry and so forth. And that has to some degree been successful. I don't think it has been a big success. And my indicator for saying that is essentially that it has not popped up in the curricula of the engineering faculties. So it has not been fully accepted as a part of engineering training, right? And that fits to the characterization that I gave before, that maybe it was a little bit more branding. It was like made in Germany. Now we do made by Industry 4.0. So that's the response directly to the question. I'd also like to come back to Ulrike's points about industrial policy later, because I think she has a very, very good and astute observation there. And I would sort of date the origins of this new discussion of industrial policy certainly back to 2010. Certainly to the end of the financial crisis, when there was a lot of soul searching, how are we continuing? And back to this big data debate, when it became clear that some countries are not well positioned in this new internet-based big data world. But I can do that later. I want to give you back the moderation.
Okay. Yeah, well, thank you. Excellent, thank you. Ulrike, something to tell us why the US is so strong in these platform industries?
Well, so two things. So first of all, this could be fleeting, right? So if we remind ourselves where in the recent past the power of the phone, right? So the phone initially was actually a Japanese thing, right? And Sony and so was had a lot of the hardware. Then it moved to Europe where Nokia had it, and then it moved to Apple. So we don't know where it's going to move next, right? And similarly, there are quite some concerns in the US that first of all, there's a discussion of whether we should break up these GAFA companies, right? And whether antitrust has a role to play here because they're becoming so big. Leaving that aside, there's also a concern that some Chinese companies are positioning powerfully to take this away, right? So we don't know whether this is some sort of, it's not, it could be a moment in time. But your question is great. So where does this come from? And first of all, it's not just Silicon Valley, right? So Microsoft and Amazon are in Seattle. As much as we like to claim that that's California, it's actually not. It's not California, but it's fine. We'll lump them all together, the West Coast. So why is it so strong at the West Coast? And I think the reason is that America has a great appetite for rule breakers. That you know, Uber started out, basically everything they did was illegal, and people said, well, that's not quite right, but it's a great idea. Let's support this, right? And let's use it and let's try it. And then, you know, the American lawmaking allows this, right? So there's a broad access to law. So you can actually do something that hasn't been done before. And then some court will decide whether it's okay or not. Whereas in Japan and Germany, you have to wait until somebody allows you to do whatever it is you think that you want to do. So in that sense, it's just easy to do something. So there's this large market and this great energy that attracts people from all around the world to, you know, so there's a problem. Well, let's just invent around it and come up with a new idea, and then people do it, and then there you have it. So, and I think that's much harder to do in other places. Then there's, of course, the money. Right, so so in Germany, if you're a startup person with a great idea in a company, you might get some venture funding. There are $1 million here, $1 million there. You basically will spend half of your time running after the money. Whereas in the United States, you just sit here, you have a great idea. Somebody will find, you know, you'll find it easy to get funding and then get going on it. So the system is much more liquid here. I don't think there's anything specific around this, because it's not that Americans are great inventors, right? These inventors come from around the world. They're just drawn into this place because they can do it here in ways that they cannot do elsewhere. And that may go away too, right? So it may be a moment in time where we're observing this. Okay,
well, thank you. Thank you. And Ulrike, you already raised the next question, maybe that everybody else might want to answer, the question about the techno-nationalism. Of course, these are national strategies. Also, Dietmar spoke about the tension between national strategies and corporate global activities. So yeah, well, how do these visions position themselves? Is there techno-nationalism in Society 5.0, Yuko?
If I may, it is not yet said with the label of techno-nationalism, but we see coming on the national security perspective gaining, national security in terms of economics, but security as such, and gaining the space in the political debate, and with alignment with technological competitions, like DARPA's saying, I don't want to be surprised by others in terms of technology. The same kind of attitude. Now, it's maybe in the Japanese context. It's good because for the science technology, because we have much larger fund coming in, but directed in some directions. And also it's much more top-down decision and leaving less space for the bottom-up curiosity-driven scientific innovations. And we have to see how it's evolved, because it is interlinked with geopolitics and the decision-making at the political level. It is not the same than looking after 1970, 18, Métis technology policy. It was more economically driven and the catch-up phases. Today, it's global competitions, and we have to protect, in some sense, nationally from the perspective of politicians, and how to do that, because the national border is for intellectual activities, technology, it's anymore the border, but states exist and citizens exist, and that's be we have to be keen about how to make a decision in the coming years.
Yeah, okay, yeah, thank you. So of course, security issues are central. Maybe Dietmar, for Germany, one might more consider maybe the fortress Europe. Germany, of course, being part of the EU, and it's not possible for Germany to have a sort of a closed national strategy in that sense. The EU wouldn't allow that. But what do you think? Are there tendencies at the German or the European level to shut out others? And
first of all, the picture is not quite what you portrayed. The German discussion is often very, very national. It's overly national. The European sort of dimension does not play a sufficient role from my perspective, right? Because normatively, you are of course right. I mean, Germany as a country is considerably smaller than Japan. We should have our sort of Switzerland moments when you compare ourselves to China, right? Because we're tiny. It's still a large economy, but that doesn't necessarily mean that in the long run, arguments of technological sovereignty, or sort of the ability of conducting economic policy reasonably independently, that can be done without our European partners. So that's the first thing. As Ulrike already noticed, we have this tendency towards industrial policy, or at least discussing what industrial policy can do. Now, if you look back 2000 to 2010 or something like that, there was almost no discussion of industrial policy. And I think it got restarted really because we were no longer sure that our system of free trade would work without friction when either China asserts strategic prerogatives, or when the United States under Trump suddenly says, okay, we will slap on duties, customs, and so forth, and we will interfere with the sort of free trade system, America first. And the observation right now from Europe is, of course, that in many ways, that policy has not been ended under Biden, okay? There's still a component of America first in the travel restrictions that we have had for Europeans to travel to the United States, but also in some strategic moves in the semiconductor field. So the United States, starting with Trump, continued under Biden, okay, has made strategic moves to make sure that the large Taiwanese semiconductor manufacturers establish production fabs in the United States. They're trying to make sure, with a new wave of industrial policy, especially targeting the semiconductor industry, that Intel, for example, is sort of regaining its competitive edge in the 3 nanometer node space. And so that has led to a lot of soul searching here in Europe. And there is, I think, the tendency now to say, okay, if we are not sure that internationally we can source what we need economically, then we need to have state support for building the industrial strengths that we need to have. For example, in semiconductors, for example, in the data space, and in anything that has to do with data.
Yeah, thank you. Ulrike, well, it was your original question. Any reactions?
So this dichotomy is interesting, right? So we're talking about a global phenomenon. There's a technological disruption coming that is fundamentally changing how we make things, right? With the whole digital manufacturing, the digital twin, and everything is interconnected, and each part can talk to each part. We don't need humans on the shop floor anymore. All of this is governed by one advanced solution of moving everything around the shop floor and so forth. So that's the digital manufacturing. Then there is the digital society that Harayama-san is talking about, that is about how we are interconnected at all times, and that Mark Zuckerberg is envisioning how we can walk down along the street, but also have this, virtual reality with us at all times. I'm not quite sure how that's supposed to go, but that's his vision. And then there is, of course, all the guys that want to send us to the moon, and the moon is, of course, also transnational. So it doesn't belong to anybody. But at the same time as we're rolling this out, there is this whole new jockeying for position. Who's going to win this, which has these overlays of national security concerns, because nobody really wants China to win it, or the other country. I mean, Germany does not want America to win this by way of closing up or down. And at the same time, companies are again going transnational. So even as the United States wants semiconductor makers to come back to the United States or regain their edge in the US, Micron is opening a plant in Japan. And so, and the reason that the American semiconductor guys are going to Japan is that Japan has this government program. They moved the food to get the cats back into Japan. They moved the food, into Tokyo, which is a fabulous image. That's exactly what governments do, right? They move the food and wait who's coming. And so Dietmar, I would actually ask you this. I think the German government has long been not so great at moving the food, and the US has been absolutely clever about this, right? They put a lot of tasty dishes out, and then wait who's coming to show up to feast on it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think we sort of talked ourselves in terms of economic policy into the view that first of all, we don't need it. Second, it's bad. It's poo-poo, right? It's bad government intervention. Not seeing that whatever we get out of economics, the wonderful Nash equilibrium of laissez-faire and government pulls back and so forth. That's only true if everybody does it, and not when China, the United States, whoever suddenly come up with protectionist or state interventionist measures to promote their technology champions. And that has been going on. And I think there has been, as I said, soul searching and now also realization that this is part of reality and that we need to have a European reaction to that.
Well, yeah, thank you. I'd like to open now the questions to the floor. So anybody who wants to comment or wants to raise a question, you can just raise your hand. You don't have to write in the chat. If not, of course, we have a lot of, I at least still have a lot of questions. And as long as we don't see any hand coming up, we just continue our talk, our discussion. I was wondering, and there are here. Okay, Harald, please.
Yeah. Okay, so Harald Kümmerer from the DIJ. I have two questions, one for Yuko and one for Dietmar, regarding the Society 5.0. South Asian nations like Indonesia and Malaysia, actually some publications from there use rhetoric that Society 5.0 is actually already there. And even other papers, if they can run some SDG analysis on it, it's actually very convenient to say Society 5.0 is already there. Is there indeed investment going on which is bound to using Society 5.0 or not, focusing on Southeast Asia, these ASEAN countries? And to Dietmar, regarding innovation policy, how big do you consider that Society 5.0 has this sustainability component which integrates into the goals of the United Nations and so on?
Okay. Yuko, you want to?
May I start? I start with your question about SDGs. SDG has been launched in 2016, almost the same time Society 5.0. So during the discussion before the launch, when within the Japanese government, we have been looking after what's happening around the world, and including this debate on SDGs. So we have been capturing key ideas, and it was the same direction. So we say, in some sense, we have already customized, not customized, but SDGs was compatible by design when we conceptualize Society 5.0. So it's quite natural that we moved ahead. Second point, interest from expressed by Indonesia and Malaysia. Quite recently, several months ago, I have been requested by some high-level symposium organized partly by the governments of Indonesia and second one with Malaysia. They approached me because they have been interested in Society 5.0 and how to capture this, not copying Japanese policy, but they have been interested in the principles or conceptual thinking to be picked up to formulate their higher education policy or other economic policy. So that's why, and when I made some presentations, the reaction was very supportive of this idea, and not only focusing on DX, but the power of really engaging people to work together to foresee the future, but acting for the future. So basically, these ideas been really well accepted, and probably that's why you heard about these comments from Indonesia and Malaysia.
Yeah, thank you. Dietmar, SDGs.
Sure.
Yeah.
Let me, so the SDGs are now everywhere. They are in the German policy papers. And by the way, they are not just in policy, they also pop up and they are visible in the corporate sector. What we see is that SDGs are now being used to rate assets in the stock market. We see that there is sort of a guiding force behind SDGs now that I would not have expected to be so strong maybe 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And that is very, very interesting because it says that the corporate sector is reacting to this kind of goal setting, objective setting. And in Germany and the European Union, SDGs figure large in the mission orientation of the technology and innovation policies. So in most of the European countries, we now have mission-oriented policies that sort of start by proclaiming or by defining missions that are in the interest of citizens, like, for example, mobility, health, communication, and so forth, and use that as a framework to organize innovation policy and even science policy, okay? And so to Harald's question, I think it has become a really strong force. It's interesting because if you look at it from the perspective of digital transformation, right, there's a gap in the SDGs, right? They come from an age when the digital transformation wasn't such a strong force yet. So we probably over time, and there are private organizations, public organizations working on this, complement the SDGs with some, let's call it digital responsibility objectives or something like that, okay? Because that is part of the overall development as well. But again, to Harald, yes, strong influence, and it has, I would say it's part of the infrastructure, the intellectual infrastructure that is being used to define innovation policy and technology policy.
Knowledge infrastructures, as Franz likes to say.
Well, thank you. Okay, any other question? If there's no other hand popping up, I would have a question going back to this issue of maybe industrial policy. I mean, every normally when we say somebody wants to dominate an area, a new field of technology, then we normally expect that the setting of standards is very, very important. Is there in the digital transformation or in the conceptualization, it is especially the national frameworks, the role of setting standards, defining standards? Is that a strategic issue that is discussed, or is that something that we think digital transformation, well, the standards are, the interfaces are developed completely privately, they're all spontaneous, and there's no need to coordinate or to intervene? I'm just curious to know the role of standard setting in the context of digital transformation. Anybody who has some ideas or thoughts on this?
I can give you some quick reactions and let Dietmar take it out of the ballpark, because that's actually in his bailiwick more than mine. But two reactions to this. One is what's on my radar more than standards, what's popping up is intellectual property protection. That is that, especially also as pursued by the Japanese government, which is very, the patent office in Japan has gained enormous political clout lately, because it's becoming clear that that's very important. There's a policy need and also a happy policy supply. And so in a way that is a little bit about standard setting. On the other hand, what we know from the technology research is when there is this big disruption, the standards actually going to go out the window, right? Because that's what's being disrupted, and we're going back to, we're developing a new dominant design. And what's important in this jockeying for creating this new dominant design is that the speed of technology change has increased so dramatically. And some people think that that's not true, but there are all kinds of indicators that indeed, compared to 100 years ago, when yes, we developed refrigeration and we developed all kinds of interesting telephony and so forth, interesting new technologies, that currently there is a new uptick in the speed of technological change. And as that happens, standard setting necessarily will have to fall behind, right? So it is the industry that is maybe converging to certain standards first before the regulators can. But the United States, I think, back to your earlier question, has an edge in some of these developments precisely because there's this rapid evolution of going to new standards of communication, business models, and so forth. But I'm sure Dietmar has an add-on to this.
Yeah.
Yes, gladly. And I would like to focus on sort of technical standard setting. So standards in the technical sense that are there for compatibility, modularity, and so forth. And indeed, I think that has been one of the hidden strengths of Germany. And if you count the number of secretariats that were led by German institutions and so forth, we have had this statistic in the annual report of the Commission of Experts for Research and Innovation for some years. You've seen that, or you can see that Germany was leading the pack with on the order of 130 of these secretariats. The United States was second with 120, and then came Great Britain and Japan. China has by now tripled its number of secretariats. It's very clear that there is a strategic initiative going on by Chinese policymakers and, of course, private organizations to have more influence, because it's in the national interest to do that, right? Very clearly. We have other areas of standard setting for communication technologies like 5G, 6G, and so forth. So the new standard setting battle is going on for 6G because 5G is already entering implementation, of course. And that is all international. So national standard setting doesn't count anymore, because that would only cover very, very small regions and populations. So that is a form of exerting or industrial policy, if you want, and people have discovered it and they are pursuing it.
Okay, wow, I see. Yuko, you want to add?
Yeah, if I may add, not directly about the standard setting, but to promote and advocate for DX, we need to have kind of rule of the game. And for this, for example, we have not only at the national level, but the global level, debate on the data governance. And for example, OECD launched AI principles, and these kind of guiding principles are needed to make sure that we will have better use of technology, not distorted, and to secure ethically and also socially to guarantee there's no misuse and no harming human. So we will have more focus on this aspect, and quite difficult to have consensus among global community. In particular, data governance. You have EU policy, but not yet fully accepted global level. And also on this perspective, we see again national techno-nationalism in some sense, and security issues combined.
Yeah, well, yeah, thank you. You standards basically also regulatory frameworks and norms. That's definitely a big issue. Then, and to some extent, maybe the EU data protection regulation somehow, because it covers also the cross-border data transfer, is of course exerting some kind of influence outside the EU. We'll see whether it will really become a kind of global standard. It's certainly not the end of the story of regulating data. Ulrike, you mentioned the IP protection, intellectual property protection, as an important sort of aspect of the competitive game, also among nations. How about this other concept that has, I think, only popped up over the last few years, also influenced through the digital transformation or digital sort of innovation, the concept of open innovation? To what extent is it necessary for companies in order to survive in the digital age to really sort of to collaborate, to open up, to give out to make their intellectual property basically accessible, yeah, to maybe not, well, to competitors or to other companies? Is that an issue where the US is strong, or do you see that when you look at Japan, that the Japanese seem to be very reluctant to share intellectual property?
Yeah, that's a great question. The word open innovation has a lot of meanings, but if you take it narrowly to simply mean that there's a trade, that there's access to ideation and a trade of ideas, a market for ideas, then the US is far ahead, right? Because the US has always had this hypermobility of ideas and people and movement and sharing, and companies buying startup companies to get the idea and incorporate it into their research agenda. And there's certain companies in the US like Cisco, which has basically done all inorganic growth, right? It was basically just bought everybody in the vicinity and then kind of integrated into a company. Japan has long had trouble with this, right? This goes back all the way to agreements, back to the Tokugawa years, that poaching of employees is not okay, and so labor mobility has long been restricted in Japan for as a part of intellectual property protection, actually. And so lately, Japanese companies have realized that given the increase in the speed of technological change, doing everything in-house is probably not a strategy for success, and that if you want to speed yourself up, you have to basically enter the market for ideas and open up ideation processes to more sort of cross-fertilization. And that's why Japanese companies are now expending a lot of effort and money in Silicon Valley to have a presence, to see what's not only here but also here, to see what's going on, to see whether they can buy things up. I mean, if you look around what Japanese companies are doing in California, in terms of Toyota has a big AI research space here. Recruit runs a very large AI research operation here. So, and they're hiring, whoever is in California and graduating from Stanford or Berkeley or UC San Diego, and they're kind of bringing them in and then taking that knowledge back to Tokyo. So this is now a global play. I mean, open innovation is by definition global, right? And I see a lot of this in a growing activity, certainly in California. Germany too, by the way, has, as Dietmar was actually involved in the German accelerator that is operating in Silicon Valley, that is trying to tap into this metabolism, this high churn of ideas. And that is going to have a big effect on this techno-nationalism version 2.0, right? It's different from the old techno-nationalism. It's taken on a new color of having both of these aspects at the same time. There's this national view, but then also this global reach of R&D. So it's a very exciting time, and open innovation is a big portion of this, as Japan's leading companies have begun to realize.
Thank you.
If I may add,
Yuko?
Because with the emergence of AI as a technology to be captured by the big companies, usually big companies, they are not so keen with startup companies. Startup companies so small and they are so big. It is not equally partner. But related to AI, they have no competence, very limited competency within in-house. So they need to go outside, and we have very huge, not huge, but limited number, but already emerging startup company within Japan, even in Japan. So the relationship between startup and the big companies becoming more equitable in some sense, becoming partner in some sense, and it's new trend in the open innovation scene, and that's something new that we are observing, and that could be some new way of transforming big companies.
Thank you. So yeah, we have two more questions, but maybe Dietmar, you want to add?
Yes, just very, very quickly, and I'm glad to see that other people are raising questions in their hands. First of all, to IP, I think there's some really interesting developments, and this is one of the areas where I think that the Chinese government is actually miscalculating and creating an environment where there is a subsidization of patenting, over patenting, which will get in the way of their own inventors and the international inventors. It's very clear. There are other in this field of science and innovation technology. I'm not about to lecture foreign governments, please forgive me for doing that, but if you tell your academic system the only thing that counts is producing papers and working with industry and creating prototypes and so forth in engineering is worth nothing, then you are setting up that system for failure. Okay, there's no question about that. I'm very convinced of that. I'm trying to prevent something similar from happening here, that in the course of the excellence initiative and the striving for intellectual and academic glory, we forget that knowledge has a practical component, and we can do something with it for the sake and for the benefit of our societies. Now, there's another component to the intellectual property thing which concerns data. So Ulrike is completely right. Yes, markets for technology are very important, but markets for technology work with contracting. They work with licensing. Licensing is complex, okay? So we would only want to do that if it's worth. If we're now thinking about opening up data for in the digital markets initiative in Europe, the digital service initiative, these are big pieces of regulation that are coming out. I'm very much in favor of not thinking about markets, but thinking about commons, as Elinor Ostrom did, and to say, okay, we may have to open up the data. So if the big gatekeeper companies, as they are called in the DMA, if they release the data should not just released to other players and licensed out. It should be made available to the public at large. And then we have finally open access to these kind of data at large. So there was just a little bit of an addition. So that's a very important aspect now coming up in DMA, DSA regulation. And it would be great if we could get some international discussion on that going.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So, okay, Wilhelm Fosse, he had his hand raised for a long time. Please, your question or comment.
Sorry, I have
Wilhelm Fosse. Okay, yeah, you need.
Yes, I'm making. Yes. Sorry. Co-host.
Okay.
Okay, now it works. Yes. Thank you very much. Very interesting conversation. The conversation has been mostly about industries and development. Of course, that's very, very interesting and important. My question is basically from a citizen of Japan, because the concept is obviously society 5.0. And my question is to Dr. Harayama. And the question was already raised initially, and that is, to what degree over the last 5 or 6 years has Society 5.0 really changed Japan? Or do you see any specific evidence where you see changes already developing? And you said, you know, this is no longer a baby. My question is because of this. I live in Japan, and when I applied for my COVID passport, for example, there was a lengthy process. I got an A4 paper in the end, which is printed. There was no facility at this point to get any electronic COVID passport. So in that sense, the passport is basically meaningless unless I travel abroad. When I'm, the other example that I have, which I'm always curious about, I remember seeing you 2 years ago in a presentation talking about like drones bringing products to people in front of their houses and landing there. The reality in Japan is, of course, for example, that Japan, at least where I live in Tokyo, does not have any smart meters. So every month there is a woman coming around and come to every house counting the gas, electricity, and water. And when I talked to the people from Tokyo Gas, you know, I just got a new meter just recently. So is this a smart meter? I said, no. Isn't this the way to go? Because then you don't have to send someone around. But the answer was, well, then all these women would be unemployed. Other examples would be payments and fintech in Japan. My big supermarket basically gives me a 3% reduction if I pay in cash. They don't want me to use electronic payment systems. It's possible nowadays. It's a bit more easier now. But anyway, I don't want to drag this too long, but I really do not see any significant change over the last 6 years, even 10 years. Japan was ahead for a long time, and there were specific inventions like touchless systems to go in and out of JR system and so on and so forth. But since then, there has hardly been any invention where I see there's any progress. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yuko, you don't have to defend Japan, but maybe you can say something.
I recently had the same experience than you. I have been visiting Europe. And when I came back to Tokyo, really complicated, but we have to have paper documents, not on the smartphone, but so many things that you have to have hanko and so many things. So it's the reality. I agree completely with you because I'm living in Tokyo. So having said that, the question is not only technological aspects. We do have technology facilitating potentially our life. And it is already in place in another place than in Japan. As I see the barrier in some sense, not advocating like Society 5.0 to move in this direction, but we have first barrier in terms of the regulations, because in some sense we are familiarized from early in the life to respect kind of rules of the game. And it is still extending the field of almost all activities, not strictly, but we have to follow the rules of the game. Including companies, when they try to explore new models, they ask the government to set up broadly a framework for regulations, because within the regulation, they are safe, they are secure, so they can take actions. But if they are acting beyond this frame, they don't know how to protect themselves. So they are reluctant to innovate, like it has been described for the Ulrike in the case of the US. So this still in place. And what I want to say is that not only policy drive or conceptualization, but we need to really review our way of acting based on these regulations. This is really, and once it is allowed to use some devices, it goes so fast and expanding quickly. But to move this first barrier is always so complicated. And just an example, when you come back from outside, you have still 2 weeks quarantine. And it's no way to change even the number of cases decrease today, but still the regulation is in place for I don't know how many. So I feel like you, but it takes time.
Yeah. Thank you. We have a question in the chat. Thank you for the inspiring presentations. How would you characterize the strategies to handle the social, legal, and ethical issues of the digital transformation in the 3 countries? I think we mentioned, Society 5.0, and Yuko, you mentioned some of the social issues like inclusion. Of course, the question is how to get inclusion. Ulrike was mentioning some difficulties in the US, regional disparities, but there might also be disparities among age groups and income groups. And then, of course, ethical issues, legal issues with privacy, ethical issues. Is this topic of regulation? I think in Europe, in Germany, we are very much aware of the need to regulate. Of course, we in our images, we need rules. Yeah. US, Ulrike said, well, let's move first. The rules come later. I know, well, Japan is a little bit waiting always what others are doing. So what priority, we probably don't have time to go into detail for, social, legal, ethical issues, but what's the priority given to the regulatory framework in the 3 countries? Yuko, what do you think? Is regulation in the discussion of Society 5.0, has regulation been a strong point, a strong focus?
I would say social, legal, ethical issues much more further than regulations, because it's linked to the value of the society. Having said that, we are trying, when we are from the government perspective, when we are opening new funding for new technologies, we try to accompany advancing technology, at the same time think about social, legal, ethical implications. So quite a new trend, but now among funding agencies, they are tackling these issues, coupling with those who are developing new technology, developing new scientific field to think about. And first step was really to make sure that they have to make dialogue with society, not just doing research, but engage your research activity with ordinary citizen and foresee potential impact of your research results on society and also ethical and legal aspects. So it's at the beginning, still we are at the beginning, but we are integrating this dimension to accompany technological advancement, at least at the political level and those who are doing research activities.
Okay, thank you. Dietmar, would you agree that in Germany, of course, we always think about rules and how to regulate?
I think it's a yes, but it's also a complex issue, of course. I think the issue has been brought to the fore by two developments. One is, of course, data privacy. I mentioned before that in 2010, 2011, we used to discuss Facebook as a productive, good force that would support democracy. That image is gone completely. I mean, that's the evil empire now. It's even more evil than Google, although Google is probably sitting on more data on each of us than Facebook. But never mind. So data privacy is a driver here. The other driver is artificial intelligence, and in particular, of course, facial recognition, sort of optical recognition of individuals, control of movement. And there, it's not a German question. I think it's driven by the European Parliament. The European Commission and the European Parliament are in a discussion right now to decide on AI regulation. And there's tension here, because on the one hand, even Europe, even Germany is now moving to the view that you should wait a little bit. You shouldn't regulate immediately and do the wrong thing. You should have a sandbox, or a Reallabor, as we call it in Germany, where you try things out and then you regulate, knowing what you have learned. But the other pushing force is, of course, that under the pressure of technological developments, there is a push, and that is present right now, even in the discussion of the three parties that may make up the new government in Germany. It's present in the discussion in the sense that in some cases, in some areas, we may need regulation fairly soon. So it's a big debate.
Ulrike?
Yeah, so the US is the opposite of Germany in many ways in this regard, I think. And that's a very interesting push also in this development. So if you look at books about the digital transformation, and you just look at the book cover, so you do this, you go to a bookstore in Japan, you go to a bookstore in Germany, and you go to a bookstore in the United States, and you look at the covers, what you'll see is that Americans are, or the American expression, the first expression that you notice is fear. Fear of the robot, fear of replacement, fear of everything. If you go to Japan, there's a sort of, it's a cute little aibo, or, you know, there's a dog, and there's much more sort of an embrace, partially because of demographic change or whatnot, but it's not expressed in the same way as a fear. And the Germany, somewhere in the middle, there's a fear, but nothing. So why are Americans so afraid of the computer? It is precisely because, maybe ironically, because there's no privacy anymore here, right? So Scott McNealy, the founder of Netscape, many years ago said, forget privacy. Like in 1996, he said, forget privacy. It's over. Game over. And that is really what enabled, back to your earlier question, that is what enabled Google. If you have a Gmail account, right, you know that you have a spam checker. The only way that Google can run the spam checker is if it reads every single one of your emails. I mean, it machine reads it, right? But still, it reads it. So there is a deep-seated recognition in the United States that there is no longer any privacy, and that makes people fearful because society does not move in these ways in the same way. With the average American is just as nervous about privacy as the average German or Japanese or anybody. And yet we have kind of allowed Facebook to invade that. And I think that the cat is out of the bag, or whatever the saying is, that is now resulting actually in some rethinking, and the way America thinks about this is antitrust. It has historically always done that, right? We think about protecting privacy or consumer protection through antitrust measures, which is kind of an interesting, different approach. But partially there is a global ramification of this, which is what the Europeans are trying to stop. But yeah, it's a huge issue, and I don't think America is going about this quite the right way. But there is no way to regulate this anymore here.
Okay. Well, thank you. There's another hand up. Maybe the last question for today. Ross.
Hi, I'm trying to turn it on. Thank you. This is Ross. I guess you can hear me. I would like to summarize the seminar, give a remark, and then a question to Dietmar person. It seems like Germany is trying to market the technology in the industry. Japan is trying to spread the technology to the society. And I guess when I used to work in Thailand, they try to bring in technology for their own. Also, they have 4.0, Thailand 4.0 plan, bring in the technology to the country. And China, I guess, as I'm from Hong Kong, what I read is they want to keep the technology in the hands of the government. That's my guess. My question to Dietmar is, what is the role of EU in, are they in the picture in forming the future society, or do you have any thoughts about it? Thank you.
Yes, gladly. The EU is very much in the picture, and almost all of the regulation that is nowadays relevant is decided at the European level. I think the EU policies are very much informed by trying to bring policies, by trying to bring or shape technologies in such a way that they can be helpful to citizens, and that sort of dangers are minimized reasonably well. It's a tedious process at times. Europe is a tedious model. If you're living here, before something tangible comes out, it takes a while. But in these areas right now, for example, AI, where there's a huge debate, I think the EU is moving relatively swiftly.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I mean, that was really a splendid discussion, and of course, stimulating presentations to start off with. I thank all the speakers, and we recorded this session, and hopefully you will be able to upload it in our YouTube channel. So for those who could not listen to the whole, or who want to spread it, share it with others who could not join tonight, please do so. I thank very much the speakers. I think, as Ulrike mentioned, well, digitalization, a global phenomenon, a global trend, but the national responses, the national strategies, quite different. So I think it's really worthwhile to compare, of course, also to cooperate, collaborate, and I'm sure we're gonna continue this kind of discussion also in the future. But for the time being, thank you very much, and have a nice day over there in California. Good night in Japan, and a good afternoon to those in Europe. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.